So I would like to introduce Mr. Daniel Montalvo, the keynote speaker of the day. He's an expert and group lead for sustainable resource use in industry at the European Environmental Agency. He will speak about decoupling. Bara til að segja ykkur það þýðir aftenging. Það semst hvernig maður aftengir hagvöxt og losun gróðurhúsalofttegunda. Stundum heldur maður þetta mun alltaf fylgjast og þá fer illa. Sorry about this. He will speak about decoupling and how that process can contribute to the sustainability transition. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. I'm sorry I have to do this in English, but my Icelandic language is only 24 hours old, so I also had some challenges to understand what was said before. But I understand we were talking about money, and I will be making the case here that we need that money and we need to use it in a very different manner. But before the climate stripes, we have them here. They are in the template of this presentation, and they represent the evolution of the average temperature in the planet from 1850 to today. And we can see that the planet is warming. And I want to make them a bit personal for you. This is the moment where my grandmother was born. If we go a few years later, you will see when my father was born. And now is the moment where I will confess my age to all of you. Here is when I was born, and then here you see when my first son was born. If you put your own arrows in the slides, you will see a very similar pattern, probably. What I want to communicate here is that in the span of 4 generations, a lot has changed for the climate at planetary scale, but also in the way that we behave. My grandmother was born in Spain, where I'm from, and she was mostly vegetarian. Only 1 day a week she could afford having meat in her meal. When she got married, she celebrated only for 2 days, and she went to the village nearby, which is 4 kilometers away from the one she was born, and she used a horse for that. If we go all the way to the moment my son was born, you can see that everything changed. He took a plane for the first time when he was 4 months old. And you may think that everything has happened in these 4 generations. Actually, it's not true. Most of the changes are happening only in the last 2 generations. We haven't seen a pace of change in a planetary system with the information we have from science that is that quick. And this is because humans have become one of the most successful species in the planet. Not the most, because there are also other species that have managed to be quite successful, but one of the most. And again, you can see that the pace of this phenomenon has accelerated incredibly in the last few years. We were 4 million 12,000 years ago, around 200 million by year 0, and we stayed stable for many years until the last 200 years ago, when with technology we were able to push the carrying capacity of the planet for our own species. But we may be reaching now a moment where this is not possible anymore. And this is something that science has called with different names, the Great Acceleration, the Anthropocene. And what basically means is that our socioeconomic trends, no matter where you look, are of course exploding because of this population growth and many other factors, technology and so on. And they are coupled with many of the planetary systems, many of the biogeochemical cycles of the planet. And this is the first time a species is able to couple itself with these planetary systems. So what we are now facing is a moment in time in which we need to decouple these 2 elements, socioeconomic trends and the planetary systems. And this is not something that we say in the European Environment Agency, where I come from. It's said by internationally recognized panels of scientists. We have the IPCC, which works mostly on climate issues, which is the topic of today. But there is another panel of scientists looking into biodiversity issues, a crisis that is even more complex than the climate change crisis. And there is a panel also looking into the way we use resources in our economy. And they kind of converge around these four elements. On the one hand, they are all signaling that time is running out. This sense of urgency is all over the place in the reports. This decade is key. We need to substantially change the way we operate so that these changes can be managed in an orderly manner. Some of the changes are already irreversible. Any system has certain flexibility, and you can push the system and it will return to its equilibrium if that pressure is no longer there. But if you push it too much, that system breaks and the equilibrium is displaced to another point. The third thing that they are all insisting about is this concept of tipping points. So far, for the climate aspect that we are discussing today, there is a certain linear relationship between the underlying issue, which is the emission of greenhouse gases, and the climate system changes. But there is a point in time when other sources that we don't control can be then releasing greenhouse gases and accelerating completely this phenomenon. We need to avoid reaching these tipping points. And something that they all say as well is that all is interconnected. For instance, if you look at the reports from the International Resource Panel, they will say that 50% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated to the way we extract and process raw materials. And 90% of biodiversity loss is associated to the way we extract, process, and produce products in our economy. The concept of decoupling is explained here. So basically, you have a parameter from a socioeconomic trend, let's say gross domestic product, and then you see how is connected to an environment aspect, for instance, resource use. Decoupling it would mean that you would continue growing that socioeconomic parameter, and you would be, in a first instance, reducing the pace. This is connected to the natural phenomenon that's called relative decoupling, or even completely uncouple the two parameters, which is called absolute decoupling. And this is where we need to go, to absolute decoupling. So far, with technological approaches and with incremental change, we've managed for many parameters of the environment and climate systems to achieve this relative decoupling, but not so much this absolute decoupling. And I show here the emissions of the European Union in this particular slide of greenhouse gases, and they've been reducing through very impactful policies. Now we have a much stronger ambition to reduce. And if you look into the known measures that countries are submitting to us, and we make a projection, and if we even make an additional projection where we see what could happen with these additional measures that they have in mind, we will not achieve this speed, which is 3 times the speed that we can observe in recent years. We unpack this a little bit more. We have, on the one hand, to reduce final energy consumption in our societies, and we need to do that 4 times faster than what we are doing according to the objectives that we set for ourselves in the European Union. When it comes to renewable energy, we need to accelerate the deployment of this infrastructure by 2.5 times. And then there is a third leg, which is negative emissions. We've realized that we will not be emitting 0 emissions by 2050. We will still have some level of emissions. To compensate that and become climate neutral, we need to have negative emissions. There are 2 ways of doing that. On the one hand, technological approaches like carbon capture and storage, very expensive, not yet available at the industrial scale. And a second one, which is using nature to absorb carbon, use agriculture and forestry and so on. With the information that we have from satellites and other sources, we can see that nature is actually decelerating its capacity to absorb carbon. So we need to reverse that. So I think the case of urgency is now deployed. Let's move on to the solutions. So what I wanted to communicate here today is that we need to rethink the way we provide ourselves with the things that we need. We have four main systems that provide for us: the energy system, the food system, the mobility system, and the industrial system. With technological changes alone, I was making the argument that we would only relatively decouple emissions from economic activity. So we need to go to a paradigm shift. If I take an example that everybody can relate, mobility, an incremental change mentality would be just electrifying cars. We need to fix the car. We fix it by putting a battery there instead of using an internal combustion engine. What we are after here is actually changing mobility, thinking of mobility as a service that we need, but we may provide it in a smarter manner. We could use cars that we use as a service. We could use self-driving cars that optimize consistently the system in a way that they are used for my trip, and then after that for the trip of some other person. We may have situations where we don't need a car at our disposal just for us or our family, and we can share that trip. In general, we need to rethink the way we provide that particular service. And this is an academic explanation of this change, which has, of course, very logically two main conditions. One is that you need ideas that will replace the system that is in place. And then you need these ideas to scale up and become prominent. And second, you need the old ways to phase out. And normally when we discuss this with policymakers, they think that the difficult part is to have these new ideas and scale them up. This is what we would do with the EU taxonomy that was discussed before. We would drive money to nurture these new ideas. This is indeed very important and challenging, but the difficult thing is to stop doing what you are used to do. This is for anybody, and it's also for our society as a whole. When you experiment, you have these new ideas, and we have many new ideas in our societies. As I say, you need to experiment, accelerate, institutionalize, and then they become the norm. When you have to phase out, you optimize your way until the very last possibility that you have from an engineering perspective, and then you need to change to something else, which means that it needs to destabilize, it needs to break down, it needs to phase out. And this will generate many conflicts. And that's the problem here, that we need to handle these conflicts. We need to have a transition that is just. Otherwise, we will lose citizens, we will lose the business community, or we will have disruption in our governance. And for that, enabling conditions are very important, and colleagues before have explained about ways to ensure that these enabling conditions are in place. But there is even more. We had that simple idea of decoupling, but we can even have a deeper decoupling, meaning that perhaps just increasing GDP would not be coupled anymore with additional well-being. What we are after is our societies being the happiest possible, and that's the parameter that we need to look at. And we need to look at that parameter then in relation to the environment and climate parameters that we can measure, and these are the ones that we need to decouple. This is where we need to put our emphasis. So now I can share 3 messages that I would like you to keep for yourselves, to take back home. These are the 3 things that, if I'm successful, you may have understood from my talk. The first one is that we no longer can approach environment policy with incremental changes alone and basing ourselves in technology. Technology is important. Incremental change will play a role in many things, but it's not enough. The second one is that solutions will imply a complete rethinking of the way we make money, if we are a business, the way we consume, if we are a citizen, and the way we produce policy, we decide in a society, the way we govern. And finally, this very important concept that is emerging in policy making, which is that any ecological transition needs to manage the disruption, needs to be just. And this has to happen within our countries, but also globally. Because today, nothing happens just in our country. Value chains are international. We need to be assertive to our trading partners. To be assertive meaning that we need to ask for them to also come along in this trip, in this transition to a better future. But we also need to know that sometimes we'll have to be generous towards them so that they can also enjoy the way of living that we have in the Western world. And that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for listening.